I remember the exact moment the room went quiet. Thomas Harper, my fiancé's father, a retired Marine gunnery sergeant with 40 years of pride in his voice, was halfway through explaining to me how the Marine Corps really worked. One elbow rested on the dining table, his fork hovering over a half-eaten piece of roast chicken. And he spoke slowly, the way people do when they're certain the person across from them just doesn't understand. That's the problem with civilians, he said. They read a few headlines, watch a war movie, and suddenly think they know what command means. My fiancée shifted beside me. Her mother studied her plate. Thomas took a satisfied sip of iced tea. I folded my napkin, looked him in the eye, and said calmly, Thomas, I actually do understand command. He raised an eyebrow. I'm the Marine general assigned to your base. For a moment, no one moved. My name is Adrian Cole. I'm 51 years old. And for the last 3 decades, the Marine Corps has been the single constant in my life. 2 weeks before that dinner, I had taken command of the Marine installation outside Quantico, Virginia. The brass nameplate outside the office still looked too new, the letters bright against the polished wood. Command transitions in the Corps are formal affairs. There are ceremonies, speeches, handshakes, and the band playing the Marine hymn while rows of uniforms stand perfectly still in the summer heat. But the ceremony is the easy part. Once the music stops and the last salute is returned, the real work begins. Command is quieter than people imagine. It's long mornings that start before sunrise and evenings that stretch far past when the buildings empty out. It's stacks of readiness reports, personnel briefings, and operational decisions that follow you home long after you leave the office. Every decision carries weight because somewhere beneath the paperwork are thousands of Marines whose lives and careers depend on those choices. After 30 years in uniform, I understood that responsibility better than most. What I hadn't expected was that my personal life would become complicated at the exact same moment my professional life reached its highest point. 2 months before that command ceremony, Rachel Harper had asked me to marry her. Rachel wasn't a Marine. She worked as a cybersecurity contractor for the Department of Defense. The kind of job that sits quietly behind the scenes but keeps entire systems running. She was thoughtful, steady, and far more patient than most people I'd known in the military. We met 3 years earlier during a network security overhaul at a joint readiness facility in Norfolk. She already knew what I did for a living. My rank wasn't a secret, but outside work, we rarely talked about the details of my career. Not because it was classified. It was simply easier to be Adrian when I wasn't wearing the uniform. Rachel understood that. About a week after I arrived in Virginia to take command, she came by the townhouse I'd rented near the base carrying 2 bags of groceries and the slightly nervous expression she gets when she's about to bring something up. We cooked dinner together with the windows open. Warm summer air drifting through the kitchen while cicadas hummed outside. Halfway through the meal, she cleared her throat. My parents want to meet you. That sounds reasonable, I said. Rachel nodded slowly. But she didn't quite look at me. There's just one thing. Whenever someone starts a sentence that way, it's never small. She rubbed the back of her neck. My dad's a retired Marine, gunnery sergeant, Vietnam era. I waited. He's traditional. Traditional how? Rachel exhaled slowly. He thinks the Corps has changed too much. Too political. Too soft. I'd heard that opinion before. But she wasn't finished. He also doesn't know your rank. That made me pause. What does he think I do? Rachel gave an embarrassed smile. I told him you were a logistics consultant. I stared at her for a moment. You told your Marine gunnery sergeant father that I'm basically a contractor. She winced slightly. I panicked. Then she added quietly. And I might have kept panicking for the last 3 years. I couldn't help a small smile. Rachel shrugged. Because the moment he hears Marine general, the entire conversation becomes about rank. I wanted him to meet you first. I considered that. Then I nodded. All right. She blinked. All right. I'll come to dinner. Rachel let out a relieved breath. But before the evening ended, she said, one more thing. My dad likes to talk about the Marine Corps. I'd expect that. She hesitated. And he can get intense. I took a sip of coffee and said calmly. That's fine. At the time, I believed it. Rachel Harper wasn't the kind of person who filled a room with noise. She was the opposite of that. Quiet. Observant. The sort of woman who listened first and spoke only when she had something worth saying. That was probably why we worked well together from the beginning. We met 3 years earlier during a joint systems audit in Norfolk. The Marine Corps had brought in a civilian cybersecurity team to evaluate a network vulnerability that had been giving our logistics division trouble. Rachel was the one leading the technical side of the review. Most people in those meetings talked too much. Rachel didn't. She watched the room, took notes, asked 2 or 3 precise questions. And by the end of the session, she usually understood the situation better than anyone else at the table. I noticed that. A few months later we ran into each other again during another readiness review. Then again during a planning conference in Arlington. Somewhere between those meetings. The conversation stopped being strictly professional. Rachel had grown up in North Carolina in a small coastal town not far from Camp Lejeune. The Marine Corps had been part of her life long before she met me. Her father, Thomas Harper, had served 2 tours in Vietnam as a Marine gunnery sergeant. He retired in the late 70s, settled back in his hometown, and spent the next 40 years carrying the Marine Corps with him everywhere he went. The Corps wasn't just a chapter of his life. It was his identity. Rachel had warned me about that early on. My dad respects the Marine Corps more than anything. She once told me. Sometimes more than the people in it. I understood what she meant. Marines of that generation often saw the Corps through a particular lens. The one they remembered from their own service. Discipline. Hard edges. Clear lines of authority. Over time, institutions evolve. But the memories people hold on to rarely do. Rachel knew that better than most. He's proud. She said the night she told me about the dinner invitation. Opinionated. But not a bad man. I've met Marines like that before. I said. She smiled faintly. Yes. But there's another thing. I looked up from the cutting board. What's that? He believes leadership has changed too much. That rank gets handed out easier now than it used to. That didn't surprise me. Every generation thinks the next one had it easier. Rachel hesitated for a second before continuing. And there's something else. I waited. He thinks people should prove themselves before they speak about the Corps. That's a fair standard. Rachel gave a small nod. It is. She paused again, clearly choosing her words carefully. That's also why I didn't tell him your rank. I leaned back slightly in my chair. So Sunday night I'm meeting a retired Marine gunnery sergeant who believes leadership should be earned the hard way. And he thinks I'm a civilian consultant. Rachel winced. When you say it like that, it sounds worse. I shrugged. It'll be fine. She studied my face for a moment. You're not bothered. Why not? Because in the Marine Corps, you spend your entire career being introduced by rank. Sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes it's exhausting. And once in a while, it's useful to find out who people think you are when the rank isn't part of the conversation. I picked up the knife again and continued cutting vegetables. Your father wants to meet me, I said. Rachel nodded. Then we'll have dinner. She looked relieved. But before the conversation ended, she added quietly. Just remember, when my dad talks about the Marine Corps, he means every word. I believe that. What I didn't realize yet was how strongly Thomas Harper believed he was protecting the honor of something he loved. And how certain he already was about the kind of man he thought I must be. The drive to Rachel's parents' house took about 30 minutes. Late Sunday afternoon sunlight stretched across the Virginia highway, catching the tops of the tall pines and turning their edges gold. The road curved through quiet stretches of woodland and small towns where church steeples rose above low rooftops and old gas stations still had hand-painted signs in the windows. Virginia has a way of feeling steady. Not fast. Not slow. Just settled. Rachel drove with both hands on the wheel. Her attention fixed on the road ahead in the way people do when they're thinking about something they'd rather not say out loud. I watched the passing trees for a few minutes before speaking. You're nervous. She gave a small laugh. Is it that obvious? A little. Rachel glanced at me briefly. I just want this to go well. That's reasonable. She took a breath. My dad can come off strong. I've met strong personalities before. That's not exactly what I mean. I waited. Rachel chose her words carefully. He believes the Marine Corps is the most important institution in the country. He believes discipline solves almost every problem. And he believes people should prove themselves before they start explaining how things work. That sounds like a Marine gunnery sergeant. Rachel smiled faintly. Exactly. The road narrowed as we turned onto a residential street lined with modest ranch-style houses. Most of them had small lawns, neat hedges, and American flags hanging from front porches. A few houses had Marine Corps flags as well. Rachel slowed the car. That's his, she said. The Harper house stood near the end of the block. White siding, a carefully trimmed yard, and a tall flagpole in the front lawn. The American flag flew at the top. And beneath it hung a faded red Marine Corps banner that had probably been there for years. Rachel pulled into the driveway, but didn't turn off the engine right away. You don't have to do this, she said quietly. I said I would. I just mean, if he starts getting intense. I turned toward her. Rachel, I'm a Marine. She laughed softly. Fair point. She finally turned off the engine. We stepped out of the car and walked up the short path toward the porch. Before we even reached the door, it opened. Thomas Harper filled the doorway. He was taller than I expected for a man in his 70s. Broad shoulders. Straight posture. Silver hair cut short enough that it looked like he'd left the Corps only a week ago. Even out of uniform. There are certain habits Marines carry for life. The way they stand. The way they watch a room. The way they measure people in a single glance. Thomas Harper did all three. "Rachel," he said, gripping her hand firmly. "Good to see you. Kid. Good to see you too. Dad." Then his attention shifted to me. He studied me in the quick, silent way Marines sometimes assess new recruits. Not unfriendly, but direct. "You must be Adrian." "That's right." He stepped forward and offered his hand. Thomas Harper. His handshake was solid and brief. "Nice to meet you, sir." Behind him, another figure appeared in the hallway. Linda Harper was smaller than her husband. With kind eyes, and the calm expression of someone who had spent decades balancing a strong-willed Marine under the same roof. "You finally brought him," she said warmly. Rachel smiled. "Mom. This is Adrian." Linda hugged her daughter first. Then turned to me. "Welcome. Come in." The house smelled like roasted chicken and fresh cornbread. As we stepped inside, I noticed the details immediately. Framed photographs lined the hallway wall. A younger Thomas Harper standing in dress blues. Black and white photos of Marines in dusty airfields decades ago. A folded American flag in a glass case. And a shadow box filled with ribbons, medals, and worn rank insignia. Thomas noticed where I was looking. "Vietnam," he said simply. I nodded once. "Thank you for your service." He gave a small grunt that might have been approval. Then he gestured toward the dining room. "Let's eat." I didn't realize yet that by the end of that dinner, the quiet confidence in that room was about to shift in a way none of us expected. The dining room looked exactly the way Sunday dinners are supposed to look. A solid wooden table. 4 plates already set. A bowl of mashed potatoes steaming near the center. A dish of green beans cooked with bacon. And a roasted chicken that smelled like it had come straight out of someone's childhood memory. Linda moved quietly between the kitchen and the table, setting down glasses of iced tea, while Rachel helped carry the last of the dishes. Thomas Harper sat at the head of the table. I took the seat across from him. That alone told me something about the way he saw the room. In the Marine Corps, seating arrangements often reveal more than people intend. Once everyone settled in, the first few minutes were easy. Linda asked where I grew up. A small town outside Dayton, Ohio. My father had served in the Air Force as a maintenance officer. Rachel mentioned a hiking trip we'd taken the previous fall. Thomas talked about how the town had changed since the 70s. It was the kind of polite conversation families used to feel each other out. Then, slowly, the subject turned. It always does when Marines are in the room. Thomas leaned back slightly in his chair and looked at me. "Rachel says you work in defense logistics." "That's right." "What kind of work?" "Coordination mostly. Personnel movement. Infrastructure planning. Supply readiness." He nodded slowly. "Civilian side." Thomas took a sip of iced tea. "Well, logistics is important," he said. "The military runs on it." "That's true. Most people don't realize that." Rachel shot me a quick glance across the table. I kept my expression neutral. Thomas seemed satisfied with the conversation so far. "Back in my day," he continued, cutting into his chicken, "we used to say amateurs talk tactics. Professionals talk logistics. That's still true today," I said. He nodded approvingly. For a few minutes the tone stayed comfortable. But the Marine Corps has gravity. Conversations drift toward it whether you plan them to or not. Thomas began telling stories from his time in service. Training exercises in the desert. Young Marines learning discipline the hard way. Long deployments where the chain of command was the only thing keeping people steady. His voice carried pride. Real pride. But underneath it there was something else. A quiet frustration with how much the world had changed since then. "You see," he said at one point, gesturing lightly with his fork. "The Corps used to be simpler." Rachel shifted slightly in her chair. Thomas continued. "You knew who the leaders were. You knew who had earned their place." Linda gave him a look. "Thomas, I'm just talking," he said calmly. Then he turned his attention back to me. "Problem today is everybody wants authority. Fewer people understand responsibility." I nodded politely. "That's a challenge in any organization." Thomas leaned forward. "Let me ask you something. Adrian. All right. You ever worked around Marines directly?" "Sometimes." "Well then, you know command isn't about titles." He spoke slowly now, like he was explaining something important to a student. "It's about respect." I nodded once. "I agree." Rachel cleared her throat. But Thomas wasn't finished. "You see a lot of civilians these days thinking they understand military life," he said. Linda tried again. "Thomas, I'm just saying," he insisted. His eyes settled on me again. People talk about command like it's just another management job. He took another bite of chicken. But leadership in the Corps, he said. That's different. I waited. Thomas leaned back in his chair, completely certain of himself. And most folks outside the uniform don't really understand it. The room grew quiet after that. Rachel looked uncomfortable. Linda focused carefully on her plate. Thomas, meanwhile, seemed satisfied with the point he'd made. I realized something then. Thomas Harper wasn't trying to insult me. Not really. He was defending something that had shaped his entire life. The Marine Corps, as he remembered it. But he had already decided who I was. Just another civilian sitting at his table. Someone who couldn't possibly understand command. And the evening was only halfway finished. Thomas Harper finished his sentence with the quiet certainty of a man who had spent most of his life being the most experienced person in the room. And most folks outside the uniform don't really understand it. He took another sip of iced tea and set the glass down with a soft clink. For a moment, no one spoke. Linda passed the bowl of green beans down the table. Rachel shifted slightly in her chair. I took a slow drink from my glass and set it back beside my plate. I imagine that's been your experience, I said. Thomas nodded once. 30 years around Marines, he said. You learn a few things. I believed him. Pride and arrogance are often confused. But they aren't the same thing. Pride usually grows from something real: discipline, sacrifice, years of work. But when pride settles too deeply, it can turn into certainty. And certainty can make a man stop questioning his own assumptions. Thomas leaned forward again. So what exactly do you do in logistics planning? Mostly coordination between departments, I said. Personnel movement, supply readiness, infrastructure planning. He nodded slowly. Sounds complicated. It can be. You ever been on a base during a deployment cycle? Well, then you know how chaotic it gets. Thomas seemed comfortable now. Fully settled into the role he'd chosen for the evening. Teacher, veteran, the man explaining how things really worked. You get young officers fresh out of school, he continued, thinking they understand leadership because they read a few manuals. Rachel rubbed her temple slightly. Thomas waved a hand dismissively. No. This is important. His eyes moved back to me. Leadership in the Corps isn't theory, he said. It's experience. I nodded once. I agree. Linda gave me a small sympathetic smile from across the table. Thomas kept eating as he talked. These days you see a lot of people climbing the ladder without really earning it. Rachel sighed softly. Dad, maybe we could talk about something else. Thomas frowned slightly. What? I'm just explaining how the system works. Rachel glanced at me apologetically. Adrian didn't come here for a lecture. I'm not lecturing, Thomas insisted. Then he turned back to me again. But it's good for civilians to understand what military leadership actually requires. I could feel Rachel tense beside me. I stayed relaxed. I appreciate the insight, I said. That seemed to encourage him. Well, let me give you an example. Linda closed her eyes briefly. Thomas leaned back and began describing a training exercise from the early 70s. Young Marines under pressure. Command decisions made in seconds. Mistakes that could cost lives. The story itself wasn't exaggerated. I'd heard versions of it many times before from men of his generation. But as he spoke, the tone shifted. It moved from storytelling into instruction. Command isn't about being smart, he said, pointing lightly with his fork. Plenty of smart people fail. That's true, I said. It's about judgment, character, the kind of backbone you only build through experience. Rachel stared down at her plate. Linda carefully cut another piece of chicken. Thomas continued. You've got to know how Marines think, how they react under pressure. He paused and looked directly at me. That's not something you learn from spreadsheets. No, I said quietly. He nodded. Satisfied. Exactly. There was another short silence. Then Thomas added something that changed the air in the room. The trouble nowadays is people think leadership can be taught in classrooms. Rachel spoke quickly. Thomas ignored her. They hand out rank like it's just another promotion. Linda finally spoke firmly. That's enough. Thomas shrugged. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. Then he looked back at me. No offense. I gave a faint smile. None taken. But Rachel had had enough. Dad, she said firmly. Adrian understands the military better than you think. Thomas raised an eyebrow. He leaned forward slightly. How so? Rachel hesitated. Because she knew exactly how. But the moment hadn't come yet. So, she simply said. He's worked around it for years. Thomas gave a skeptical grunt. Well, working around it isn't the same as living it. I let that pass. Because by then I understood something clearly. Thomas Harper believed he was defending the honor of the Marine Corps. What he didn't realize was that the man sitting across from him had spent 30 years living inside it. Thomas Harper leaned back in his chair again, completely certain of himself. You don't earn respect in the Corps because someone gives you a title, he said. You earn it from the Marines under you. No one interrupted him this time. You carry responsibility every day, he continued. And the best commanders are the ones who understand the weight of that. His voice softened slightly. The way it does when a Marine talks about something that still matters decades later. When young Marines look to you for direction. That's not management. He tapped the table once with his finger. That's leadership. Rachel had gone very still beside me. Linda sat quietly, watching the two of us. Thomas finished his thought. And most people outside the Corps never really see that side of things. Silence settled over the table again. Rachel closed her eyes briefly. I folded my napkin beside my plate and placed my hands lightly on the table. Thomas, I said calmly. You're absolutely right. That seemed to please him. I met his eyes across the table. A person in command does have to earn that title every day. Thomas nodded once. Exactly. Then I continued. That's something I've learned over the last 30 years in the Marine Corps. Thomas blinked. Just once. Rachel froze beside me. Linda's fork slipped slightly against her plate. I spoke quietly. And it's a responsibility I'll have to earn here. Thomas frowned slightly. What do you mean? Here. I held his gaze. Because last week I took command of the installation outside Quantico. The room went completely still. Rachel looked at me. Then at her father. Thomas stared across the table like a man trying to decide whether he had heard something correctly. I finished the sentence calmly. As the new Marine general assigned to your base. For a long moment. No one moved. Even the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to pause. Thomas blinked again. You're... What? His voice had lost the certainty it carried just seconds earlier. I kept my tone even. I'm Major General Adrian Cole. The refrigerator hummed quietly in the kitchen. No one reached for their food. Thomas slowly set his fork down. General. He repeated. Now he studied me again. But this time it wasn't the quick assessment of a father meeting his daughter's boyfriend. Now he was searching. Looking for any sign that I might be exaggerating. That's a pretty big claim. He said carefully. It is. You're telling me you're the commanding general at Quantico. Thomas stared at me for several seconds. Then he gave a short laugh that didn't quite land. Come on now. Rachel spoke quickly. Thomas raised a hand. Hold on. His eyes never left mine. You're serious? Linda finally spoke softly. Thomas. But Thomas was already thinking like a Marine again. Testing. Verifying. Retired Marines develop instincts over time. They read posture. Tone. The way someone carries themselves. And I could see the exact moment those instincts started catching details he had missed earlier. The way I had listened. The way I spoke. The questions I had asked about base readiness. Thomas leaned forward slightly. If you're a Marine general, he said slowly, then you'd know the name of the current operations deputy. I replaced General Wallace. I said calmly. Colonel Rivera is still acting deputy until the transition review finishes next month. Thomas's jaw tightened. That answer landed exactly where it needed to. He tried again. And the readiness inspection scheduled for October. Moved up 2 weeks. I said. Logistics backlog from the last rotation. Linda inhaled quietly. Thomas sat back in his chair. For the first time all evening. The certainty had vanished from his face. And the man who had spent the last 30 minutes explaining the Marine Corps to me suddenly had nothing left to say. Thomas Harper didn't speak right away. His eyes stayed fixed on me across the table as if he were waiting for the world to correct itself. The kind of pause people make when they assume they must have misunderstood something simple. But the room stayed quiet. The refrigerator hummed softly in the kitchen. Outside. Somewhere down the street. A car passed. Thomas leaned back slightly in his chair. General. He said again. Slower this time. He rubbed a hand across his mouth. Thinking. Rachel shifted beside me but didn't speak. Linda looked between the two of us. Trying to follow the moment as it unfolded. Thomas cleared his throat. You said you replaced General Wallace. That's correct. And Colonel Rivera's still acting operations deputy. He nodded once. Almost. Unconsciously. That answer alone told him a lot. In the Marine Corps, you don't accidentally know details like that. Thomas tried again. And the inspection schedule. Moved forward 2 weeks. I said. Supply chain backlog after the last deployment cycle. He stared at the table for a moment. Then he leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. Well. He murmured. That's something. No one laughed. Rachel looked half relieved and half mortified. Dad didn't know. She said quietly. Thomas gave her a look. I gathered that. Then his attention returned to me. You didn't think to mention that earlier. I wanted to meet you as Rachel's fiancé. I said calmly. Not as a rank. That answer seemed to hit him harder than the revelation itself. Thomas nodded slowly. Right. He picked up his glass of iced tea and took a long drink. Linda finally broke the silence. Well, she said gently, that certainly explains why you were so patient. Thomas looked up at her. Patient? She raised an eyebrow. You spent half an hour explaining Marine leadership to a general. Thomas winced. Rachel coughed lightly into her hand. Trying not to laugh. Thomas shot her a look. Don't. Rachel looked down again. Sorry. Thomas rubbed his face with one hand. I suppose I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything. I said. Yes. I do. He sat up straighter now. I made assumptions. That happens. Thomas shook his head. What happened is I spent 30 minutes talking down to someone who outranks every officer I ever served under. Rank isn't the point. It is when you're explaining the Marine Corps to a general. Rachel couldn't help a quiet laugh this time. Thomas gave her another glare. Rachel. Sorry. Linda placed a gentle hand on his arm. Thomas. Breathe. He sighed. Then he looked back at me again. You really took command last week. He let out a low whistle. Well. I'll be. Another pause settled over the table. But this one felt different. Less tense. More reflective. Thomas shook his head slowly. I spent 40 years thinking I could read people. I didn't answer. And tonight? He continued. I completely misread the highest-ranking Marine I've spoken to in decades. I allowed a small smile. You weren't the first person to underestimate me. Thomas nodded once. I imagine not. Linda smiled faintly. Well, she said. Next time someone comes to dinner, maybe we ask fewer questions. Thomas looked at her. That's not how Marines work. But there was a trace of humor in his voice now. Rachel leaned back in her chair with visible relief. See, she said quietly to me. Not a disaster. I looked at Thomas again. No. I said calmly. But Thomas Harper was still thinking. Because what embarrassed him most wasn't the rank. It was the realization that he had spent an entire evening explaining the Marine Corps to someone who had spent 30 years leading it. And Marines more than anyone hate realizing they judged another Marine too quickly. Dinner ended more quietly than it had begun. Linda cleared the plates while Rachel carried dishes into the kitchen beside her. Thomas offered to help once or twice. But Linda waved him away with the quiet authority of someone who had been married to a Marine for 40 years. I stepped out onto the back porch. The evening tea air had cooled. Somewhere down the street a dog barked. And the faint sound of a baseball game drifted from a neighbor's television. The sky above the trees had turned that deep blue that always comes just before night settles in. For a few minutes, I just stood there. 30 years in the Marine Corps teaches you something about silence. After tension, people need space. Pride takes a little time to loosen its grip. The porch door creaked open behind me. Rachel stepped outside. You okay? She asked. I'm fine. She leaned against the railing beside me and exhaled slowly. Well, she said. That escalated. A little. She shook her head. I'm really sorry about my dad. You don't need to apologize. Yes. I do. I should have told him earlier. That probably wouldn't have helped. Rachel frowned. You think he would have acted the same way? Probably not. I said. But then we wouldn't have seen who he really is. She considered that. He's not a bad man. I know. He's just stubborn. So are most Marines. Rachel laughed quietly. That's true. We stood there a moment longer before the porch door opened again. Thomas stepped outside. The change in him was noticeable immediately. The certainty that had filled the dining room earlier was gone. In its place was something quieter. More careful. Rachel. He said. Yeah. Could you give us a minute? Rachel looked between us. You sure? I'll survive. I said. She nodded and slipped back inside. Thomas walked to the other side of the porch railing. For a while he just looked out over the darkening yard. Then he cleared his throat. Well, he said. That was one hell of a dinner. Yes. It was. He rubbed the back of his neck. I've replayed that conversation in my head about 10 times in the last 15 minutes. That sounds uncomfortable. It is. Thomas shifted his weight slightly. I spent half the evening explaining the Marine Corps to someone who commands more Marines than I ever met in my entire career. That happens sometimes. He shook his head. Not usually like that. Another silence passed. Then he turned toward me. I owe you a real apology. You already offered one. That one was automatic. He said. This one's deliberate. I waited. Thomas looked me straight in the eye. I judged you. I assumed you didn't understand the Corps. And I talked down to you in my own house. I nodded once. That part did happen. He sighed. You were patient about it. Patience is useful. Thomas studied my face. Most people would have corrected me a lot earlier. Probably. Why didn't you? I considered the question. Because the truth was simple. You weren't trying to insult me. I said. You were defending something you care about. Thomas looked genuinely surprised. You think that's what I was doing? He leaned back against the railing and stared out into the yard again. "You're not wrong," he admitted quietly. "The Marine Corps gave me everything. I understood that. Discipline," he continued. "Direction. Pride." He took a slow breath. "When you spend that much of your life inside something like that, you start believing you know exactly what it's supposed to look like. That's normal." Thomas nodded slowly. "And tonight," he said, "I realized the Corps moved forward without asking my permission. That tends to happen." He chuckled softly. Then he looked at me again. "And if my daughter chose you?" He paused. I clearly misjudged the situation. Thomas Harper called me 2 days later. I was in my office at the installation headquarters when my assistant stepped inside. "Sir, there's a Mr. Thomas Harper on the line. Says it's personal." For a second I just looked up from the stack of reports on my desk. "Thomas Harper." I hadn't expected to hear from him so soon. "Put him through," I said. A moment later, his voice came across the line. "Kendall Cole. Adrienne is fine," I said. He cleared his throat. "Under the circumstances. That might be fair." There was a short pause. "I won't take much of your time," he continued. "I was hoping you might meet me somewhere." "What did you have in mind?" "Well," he said slowly, "I thought maybe the base museum. The memorial garden out front." That made sense. Retired Marines tend to think best around the history of the Corps. "I can do that. Thank you." We agreed on Thursday afternoon. The Marine Memorial Garden outside Quantico's Base Museum is the kind of place where people instinctively lower their voices. Stone paths run between bronze statues of Marines from different wars. Names carved into granite walls. Flags moving slowly in the wind. Thomas was already there when I arrived. He stood near one of the statues with his hands clasped behind his back the way Marines stand when they're remembering something important. When he saw me approach, he straightened automatically. "Old habits don't fade. General," he said. "Adrian." He nodded. "Right." For a moment we both looked at the memorial wall. "You served in Vietnam?" I asked. 71 to 72. "That was a hard year." "They were all hard years over there." We walked slowly along the path. Thomas stopped near a plaque listing the names of Marines from Virginia who never came home. "I come here sometimes," he said. "I understand." He took a breath. "I didn't ask you here just to apologize again." "All right. I wanted to do it properly." I waited. Thomas turned toward me. "Sunday night I behaved like a fool." "That's a strong word." "It's the right word." He didn't look away when he said it. "I spent decades telling younger Marines that humility is part of leadership." He continued. "Then the moment I met someone who represents the next generation of leadership, I dismissed him." I stayed quiet. "The worst part wasn't the embarrassment," he said. "What was it?" "The realization that I've been clinging to an old picture of the Corps." He gestured toward the memorial. "The Marine Corps, I remember, was full of men who looked like me. Times change." "They do," he sighed. "But somewhere along the line I started believing that if things changed too much, maybe what we did back then didn't matter anymore." "That's not how history works," I said. He looked at me. "The Corps you served built the foundation the rest of us stand on." Thomas seemed to think about that for a moment. "You really believe that?" He nodded slowly. "That helps." We continued walking. After a moment he spoke again. "There's one more thing." "What's that?" "I'd like to invite you back to dinner." I raised an eyebrow. "That's brave." He smiled faintly. "This time I promise not to explain the Marine Corps to you." "That's probably a good plan." Thomas nodded. "And maybe," he added, "you could explain a few things to me instead." I extended my hand. "I'd be happy to." He shook it firmly. And for the first time since that awkward Sunday dinner, the weight of the entire situation felt like it had finally begun to lift. A week later, Rachel and I drove back to her parents' house. Same quiet street. Same white house at the end of the block. The Marine Corps flag still moved slowly in the wind above the yard. But the feeling in the car was different this time. Rachel glanced at me as she turned into the driveway. "You sure you want to do this again?" I looked at the house for a moment. "I've deployed to conflict zones," I said. "I can handle another Sunday dinner." She laughed softly. "That's not exactly the same thing." "No," I said. "This one matters more. Family always does." Dinner that night was calmer. Thomas listened more than he talked. At one point he set his fork down, looked across the table at me, and said something simple. "I spent most of my life believing leadership had a certain look. I waited. Older. Louder. Probably someone who looked like me." He shook his head slightly. "But real leadership," he said, "looks like discipline." He tapped the table once. "And patience." That stuck with me. Because a lot of people think revenge has to be loud. They imagine it as humiliation. Anger. Someone finally saying everything they've been holding back. But after 30 years in the Marine Corps, I've learned something different. The strongest response is often the quietest one. Sometimes dignity carries more weight than anger. Sometimes restraint changes a person more than confrontation ever could. And sometimes the most important battles in life don't happen on distant fields at all. They happen across dinner tables. Between generations. Between pride and understanding. Life has a strange way of teaching lessons when we least expect them. Sometimes those lessons come through conflict. Sometimes through embarrassment. And sometimes through the quiet moment when two people finally understand each other. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of a time when respect had to be earned from both sides, consider sharing it with someone who might appreciate it too. And if you enjoy stories about family, pride, and the unexpected moments that change how people see one another, make sure to follow for more stories like this. Because not every battle in life is fought on a battlefield. Some of the most important ones happen across dinner tables. Between generations, learning how to listen. Thank you for spending this time with the story. Disclaimer. This story is written for storytelling and entertainment purposes. Names, characters, and situations are fictionalized or adapted. Any resemblance to real individuals or events is purely coincidental.